Awesome, and we are live. Welcome to the Cool Data Project Show. I am Kristen Kerr, a developer advocate for Comet. And if you're looking to treat ML like science and make your work reproducible, you should check out the community edition. This is the Cool Data Project Show, where I interview practitioners in ML, DL, and AI on projects that they are working on with a focus on approach and methodology. And I am super excited to have Timothy Dobbins here with me today, who is going to tell us about how he used data to help get ahead of his son's asthma. And we all know I'm a huge fan of practical home projects, so I'm pumped to hear more about this. Timothy, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about Trilliant Health?
Absolutely. I'm Timothy Dobbins, data scientist at Trilliant Health. We are a health tech startup where we build data and analytics and predictive models to supplement some of the data that we get from our clearinghouses. Notoriously in healthcare, data is very, very messy. So part of what we're doing to combat that is supplementing that with our own models. We have on just the data science team. I think we're really taking a strong approach in tackling some of these issues by having both software engineers and data scientists, but also like a whole data curation team because there's not a lot of labeled data for the things that we're wanting to predict. So we have data labelers who are familiar with the domain and are experts in that area. They go out and label a bunch of records, and then that's what we use to train a lot of our models and do some analysis on that. So doing a lot of exciting work in that healthcare space.
Okay, awesome. And then, yeah, so I already gave a little bit of an intro on what we were going to be talking about today, but do you want to tell us about the project and a little bit about the motivation for that?
Absolutely. So the project is called Achoo, after the sneezing sound. This was a project that really started when my son was about 3 or 4 years old. He's now 12 years old, doesn't really use his inhaler a bunch anymore. But when he was about 3 or 4, that's also when I was learning how to program. So I noticed that there was a problem, namely that we could never tell when he needed his inhaler. It was always so sporadic and random. And the problem really escalated when he got to school, because he would miss a lot of class time, miss a lot of assignments, and then he would bring home those incomplete assignments, and then we would have to work on those things all night. So the biggest motivation was, hey, how can we keep my son in class and not in the nurse's office, because he was spending a bunch of time in the nurse's office. So that's where I started playing around with the Raspberry Pi. So at first, this was all tracked on the Raspberry Pi. I had 2 buttons on the Pi. Every time that he would go and every time that he would take his inhaler, he would go and push one of the buttons. And that's how I would track that. And so for about a year, I tracked his inhaler usage, and then got to the point where I wanted to start building a predictive model with all of that data that I had tracked for a year roughly. And then that's where I made a decision to automate the email sent to the school nurse so that we could try to get ahead of that. And at first, I set the threshold very, very high so I wouldn't be bugging the nurse all day with a bunch of false positives.
Mm-hmm.
So that was my way of trying to get out in front of it, because I don't know if you've ever had experience with someone with asthma, but if we were to give it to him first thing in the morning, for some reason he would be okay during the school day and he would not need his inhaler. So that was the aim behind that. Can we get out in front of it? Can we give it to him sort of preemptively so that he's not missing a bunch of class time and assignments?
And so the Raspberry Pi, was that something that, was plugged into the wall? And so, he had to be home to be able to use that?
Yeah, that was plugged into the wall. And so it was sort of hacked together at first. Mm-hmm. So if he used it at school, then I would go and push the button on the Raspberry Pi. So yeah, it was a bit hacked together at first, but that's how we did it.
That's how home projects are.
Definitely.
Yeah. And then, so you mentioned the buttons for collecting the inhaler usage. How did you collect the rest of the data that you used in the project?
like a lot of other at-home projects, non-enterprise projects, I used web scraping to get all of the data. And I scraped a bunch of different sources, government sources, private sources, weather APIs to get weather data like humidity, temperature. Also scraping government sources like the EPA to get like pollen count, allergen count, and then other sources to get air quality data like the pollutants in the air that day. And then I would gather all of that and track that along with his inhaler usage and see what were the predominant predictors of him needing his inhaler.
Yeah, and what were the prominent predictors of the data that you got? What was, the most valuable in predicting this?
Yeah, it typically wasn't like weather related data. It was usually always like pollutants or high allergen or high pollen count data days that would really cause him to need his inhaler, usually multiple times.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then, so you grabbed all the data and brought that together. What was the methodology? What did you end up using to predict this?
So at first, the focus was just getting as much data as possible because I knew if I put a model out there with only a few records, it wasn't going to be good, and the nurse was really going to get mad at me.
Right.
So instead, I spent pretty much just a year collecting data. After that, I felt comfortable training that data on a model. At first, I just used a logistic regression, something quick and easy and fast to try to get something up and going. And then setting that threshold, like I said, still setting that threshold very high so as not to bug the nurse all day with emails about my son needing to come to the office. So that was pretty. It was pretty light on the machine learning. Actually, it was heavy on the data, light on the machine learning. Didn't really focus a lot on tuning the model. The first priority was just getting something out there that worked relatively well, and then sort of building on top of that.
No, and I'm with you though, because actually when I think about it, you said your son is 12 now and doesn't need it anymore. And when I think about, the models that I was building years ago, I only heard about XGBoost in like 2016. So I was all logistic, years ago, it was all a lot of logistic regression. Right. And so how long ago was this?
This was about 2017.
Yeah, right. I was using a lot of logistic regression too.
Yeah, and I've always been behind the curve in terms of modeling. So when the newest thing came out, like I was still using logistic regression, and then when I noticed, 10 years behind the curve to start using XGBoost, when I started using that, then it was onto neural networks, and I still haven't caught up to neural networks. So I'm always behind the ML curve. I'm always using older techniques.
Nah, we're cool. But plus too, like, thank God for LinkedIn, right? Where we go, and that's sort of where I keep up on the newest models. Like, you don't always hear about them necessarily at work. It's from being a part of the community. So were there any interesting issues that you ran into along the way?
Yeah, the biggest issue was I needed to track his location as well. Because that had a lot to do with the pollen count, because the pollen count's not going to be the same here at my house as it is 5 miles down the road or 10 miles down the road. And we lived not too close to the school where he predominantly used the inhaler. So my goal there was the first step was when we're out of the house, like on the weekends, we can't always come back home and press the button on the Raspberry Pi. And even if we did that, the location's going to be off because usually we were downtown, 15, 20 miles away sometimes. So my solution to that was, okay, we're not going to use a Raspberry Pi to have the buttons anymore, unfortunately, because I love Raspberry Pi projects. But instead, we're going to build a small app that I can use on my phone. And then when he uses his inhaler, I just click the button and it'll track the location. That still didn't solve the problem of him having his location tracked at the place where he was mostly when he uses inhaler, and that was at school. So I never got to that point because this project sort of phased out as he stopped using his inhaler so much. But my next steps for that were to get him like a smartwatch and have him hit the button on that. And then I would develop an app to allow that to happen. And then Also, one thing that I noticed was the pollen count, and the allergen data, air quality data, they weren't always the biggest predictor sometimes. And I noticed this just with like a quick eyeball check, because I didn't actually start tracking this data, but I noticed that a lot of it was when he had like an elevated heart rate. So when he was exercising or running around with his friends, he would need to come into the house and take his inhaler. So that was one of my next steps before it sort of phased out when he stopped using his inhaler so much was, can I start tracking heart rate activity and then include that with the model as well?
Nice. Yeah, no, that's awesome. Those are some cool considerations. Did you think about like just writing a script to say, okay, if it's, within these days and these times, just replace it with the location of, replace my location with the location of the school?
That would have been a great idea. That is a great idea. I should have done that.
Oh, yeah.
That'll be, so my youngest son is 2. If he ever develops asthma or needs an inhaler, I'll definitely use that solution for tracking his location at school.
Yeah, you're gonna be so ready. You're gonna throw extra.
Got it. We're gonna be ready.
Yeah, so ready. So I know you don't need this project anymore. Is there anything you're working on now, or taking a break from cool projects?
Sometimes I take a break from cool projects, but I always have the builder within me, so I'm always tinkering at home. I have a couple of projects that I'm sort of working on now. I have another project for like a stealth startup that I'm working on, where we're collecting a bunch of data, open data, scraping websites, to try to help people who want to relocate do that intelligently based on preferences. So trying to match their preferences with cities that have those characteristics, like all the way from climate to like what do you prefer in nightlife. Working on, I have another project because now my son is older. He's 12 years old. So he, I don't know if for anyone watching that has, preteens or even younger kids, maybe even older kids, it's always a pain to try to keep up with a to-do list. I have to tell him constantly to, do this or that. And there's always a fine line between incentivizing with like screen or incentivizing with something else and then not giving in too much. So I have a project called Dewey, Dewey. That's on my GitHub page as well, where I try to automate that as much as possible. So he has a Trello board, has an iPad in the kitchen. He has a list of to-do tasks. And so every morning he has, things like brush his teeth, things like that. Feed the dogs, take the trash out. So when he is done with a task, he'll just slide it over to the done column on the iPad. And then when all the tasks are done, I have a script that pings the Trello API, and then also a script that will go and get his Switch console's password for that day. And that password is generated every day, so we can't memorize it because that was the first little issue that we had is he just memorized the password and didn't need to do the tasks anymore. So now it'll get that.
I love that, by the way.
It'll randomly generate like a 4-digit PIN number. And when all the tasks are done, then it'll be sent to a Slack channel that we have for our family. And then that's where he gets the PIN, and then he can go on and play his hours screen time.
Nice. Awesome. Yeah, that's certainly something I should probably implement in my home as well. And we've also had the issue of, learning the passcode to the phone. Not mine, because I am like a super secret ninja, but definitely husband's. Yeah. So what advice would you give for somebody who wants to start with building cool projects in their home?
This is probably the most important advice that I was given when working on projects, working on like unique projects specific to someone's own problems versus going out and building projects that have already been built a lot of times, and that you find in like tutorials on like medium.com, building like a Titanic data set analysis or with the Iris data set. Definitely some tips that I would have is make sure it's valuable And I think a big myth around value is that it has to be a grand, like revolutionary problem. And I think a lot of us that build side projects, I know myself, have gotten caught in that trap where I have my own problems at home that I can sort of solve with like a Raspberry Pi or some web scraping scripts. But I tend to want to focus on like big, grand, like visionary problems that like I try to think of that everyone faces and then try to solve that. But it's not really realistic. And you need big teams to do that. So I don't think it's realistic for one person to work on those very like global problems. So my advice there would be like focus on very local problems to yourself. Like all of the projects that I've built, I think I've built 4 or 5 projects for my son. All of those were problems pretty much that I faced, and maybe others faced too, but I didn't really make it accessible to others. Like there was a lot more work to go into like having users sign up for it and use the app themselves. Like I tried that for a couple of projects. It just didn't work out. So when I say like the project needs to be valuable, I definitely don't mean like it needs to be value to it doesn't have to provide value to everyone. Like it can provide value to just you and whoever's using it. So I think that's a big myth that people get trapped into, and so do I. Another big tip I would have is the project needs to be visible. Like I need to be able to go onto GitHub, or I need to be able to go to your domain and look at the project myself. Maybe and bonus points for actually being able to like play around with the project. I have a couple of not all of my projects you can go on GitHub and clone it and then start playing around with it yourself. But I do have a couple projects that you can like pip install and try like using the tool yourself. So that would be my second thing is making sure it's visible to people, that people can access it and start playing around with it. Or you can just show it off, like if it's a Tableau dashboard, show it off on your website and have people be able to click buttons and stuff. I would say the third thing is if you're breaking into, especially something like data analytics, data engineering, or data science, anything technical, I would say the project needs to like showcase your technical ability. Mm-hmm. I don't think it would be wise to like have a project that you built, but you use like another developer to build it. Like that's gonna showcase like the cool factor, but it might not showcase like what you can do day in and day out on a data science team. So if the goal is to break into data science or some other data role or technical role, the third piece of advice I would give is make sure the project showcases your technical ability. And that involves, I think, putting that up on GitHub as well, so people can go in and see the code. Like if you were to go in on this Achoo project and look at my code, it's nothing fancy. It's actually very ugly code, but my goal was just to get something out. And as long as you can talk through that in an interview, then you should be good. Like the goal for me wasn't to produce the cleanest code. It was just to get something working out. And usually on data science teams or any technical team, that's one of the biggest goals. Is unless you have like millions of users using it and there's a security, issue with it. Like one of the biggest goals on any data science team, at least, is just getting something out there that works to a user and allowing them to use it, and then we can find the bugs later. And then my fourth piece of advice would be, it doesn't always have to be unique, but it does help if the project is unique. So like interviewers know that you didn't like take this project from someone else. And even if you did take the project from someone else and you added your own, features to it, I think that's totally acceptable. Sure. But yeah, I think the project needs to be valuable, and that can just be adding value to a problem that you face. The project needs to be visible. Like I can go on and I can go look at it. You can put it on your resume. I can click a link and I can go to it on the web browser. It needs to be technical because most data roles that people are trying to break into with side projects are going to have some sort of technical component. So you need to be able to showcase your technical ability. And then finally, it needs to be unique so that, it's not just like another Titanic project or another Iris data set project. It really should show. And bonus points if you can curate and gather all this data yourself instead of like just using pre-made data sets that are already out there. Like if you can go to an API, show that you have an API script that goes and gets the data. Even if you have to scrape a website, as much as a lot of us hate scraping websites, like even if you have to scrape a website to get the data, that shows that you're willing to like put the work in to go and get the data yourself if that data set doesn't exist yet. So those are my 4 biggest pieces of advice for anyone using and leveraging side projects to break into like a technical role.
I love that. And I'm with you. It does, it does feel like people think that things need to be bigger with the projects that I'm making. I hear a lot of like, oh, would you like think of making a company out of that? And it's like, no, it doesn't actually extend. Like this is not going past my living room. But I'm able to get value out of keeping it on my GitHub. I'm able to give back to the community in that way. And it's certainly, helping to keep my own skills fresh as well, especially where I'm in developer advocacy now and I'm not in a data scientist role anymore. So 100% agree with your tips. Is there anything you feel like you want to add before? I feel like, we've talked about the project and it's been super awesome hearing you share about this. Is there any last points that you'd like to make before we close this out?
I would say exactly what you just brought up, like someone saying you should make a business out of this. That's a good piece of advice too. Like you don't have to do that. Like you don't have to start a business with your project, because for me, that happened to me too. Like I put this, as soon as I got to the point where I was ready to publish this project, the Achu project, I put it on Reddit because I was a big like participant in like the data science subreddit. So I put that project on there, and it sort of made its way around the interwebs, and I was getting calls from like from companies wanting to interview me, and then a lot of people were saying, "Hey, you should make a company out of this." And I thought about it, and then when I thought about it, it became really, really daunting, to the point like where I didn't even want to work on the project anymore, because I was like, it wasn't that like the pressure was getting high, because there was no pressure because it wasn't a company yet, but it was like, okay, now I gotta like solve for people signing up to use it. Now I gotta solve for like security things. Now I gotta solve for all of these things. Whereas if I'm just doing it with myself, there's none of that, and I can control everything. I can put it on GitHub and just have the qualifier that this is, use at your own risk. This is for my son to use, and so we can track his inhaler usage. So I would think that I would say that's a big piece of advice that I wish I would have known too, because I actually did like look into starting a business out of it. It was going to be way too expensive to actually get the data the right way by not web scraping. So I just decided to keep web scraping. And also I would say like having that project, I mentioned like when I put that on the web, a bunch of companies reached out and they wanted to interview me, which I couldn't believe, because at that point I was trying to break into data science, and now I had companies reaching out to me. So I think biggest piece of advice is if you are looking to break into data science, and I interview candidates all the time. A lot of them have side projects. A lot of them have PhD theses. Like a lot of them have a lot of cool things that they're working on. Some people don't have anything that they're working on the side. And unfortunately, like if you're trying to break into data science or another data role, like it's so competitive that that a lot of those people that don't have things they can showcase like on the side that have something to do with data science, since they don't do data science in their day-to-day, a lot of those people will get filtered out because there are so many other candidates that can showcase their work. Even though they haven't been in a data science role, they can say, hey, look at these projects that I'm building with data science tools. I do have some experience. So those people will get like first dibs on interviews and things like that. So I would say if you're trying to break into data science, and if you spend any time on LinkedIn data science, you're gonna see this advice a lot. Like if you're trying to break into data science for your first role, side projects is definitely where it's at. And I think like making sure it's valuable, visible, technical, and unique. I think those are the biggest four things that I can think of in my experience that really work to leverage that side project into a full-time data science role.
That's awesome advice. And so if people want to follow you, where can they find you?
I'm on LinkedIn all the time. That's pretty much the only platform I'm on at this point. So yeah, LinkedIn. Yeah, that's where I'm at.
Yeah. I know, right? People ask me that, and I'm like, I spend an insane amount of time on LinkedIn.
Too much.
Too much. All right. So thank you so much, Timothy, for joining. This was you shared some amazing advice, and I loved hearing all about the different aspects of the project. This was an awesome show. So thank you so much for joining me.
All right. Thanks, Christian. Loved it. Thank you.
Bye.